What if I told you that a wooden airplane shouldn't have worked at all? That by every rule of modern warfare, this aircraft represented a fundamental misunderstanding of how to build bombers. It was 1938. The world was sliding toward war. Britain was rearming frantically. Metal aluminum was scarce, rationed, precious beyond measure. And then Geoffrey de Havilland walked into the Air Ministry with a proposal that was absolutely ridiculous. A bomber made mostly from wood. No defensive guns, no armor, nothing to protect the crew except speed. The Air Ministry's response was exactly what you'd expect from military bureaucrats. A polite rejection. Wood belongs to the First World War. Metal is the future. This man was proposing something impossible. Yet here's where the story starts getting interesting. De Havilland didn't accept rejection. De Havilland persisted. And inside that persistence was the seed of an idea that would create one of World War II's most legendary aircraft. But that's not where this story really begins. This story begins with someone else. Someone nobody remembers. Someone whose name is almost forgotten. A mechanic who would take the already brilliant Mosquito and make it something even greater. Need more untold stories like this? Subscribe right now and you'll get access to forgotten WWII heroes every single week. His name was Roderick Banks. But before we get to Banks, let me explain what made the Mosquito so special in the first place. Britain in the late 1930s faced a terrifying math problem. Rearmament was accelerating. But aluminum was becoming rarer. Every branch of the military was fighting for metal. Spitfires needed aluminum. Hurricanes needed aluminum. Transport planes needed aluminum. There wasn't enough for everything. De Havilland's genius was recognizing something that others thought was a limitation. His company had spent decades perfecting wood construction. Laminated wood. Birch plywood bonded with Ecuadorian balsa and Canadian spruce using special glues. These techniques came from building furniture. From building pianos. The company understood wood construction in a way that nobody else did. Here's where this gets brilliant. If you build with wood instead of metal, you don't need aluminum. You can use furniture makers. You can use piano factories. You can use workers who were locked out of metal airframe manufacturing. The Mosquito would be a bomber built by peacetime craftsmen during wartime. It would free aluminum for fighter production. It would solve a resource crisis. The design that emerged was absolutely audacious. 2 Rolls-Royce Merlin engines, the same power plants and Spitfires. A sleek fuselage, a 16.5-meter wingspan, no gun turrets, no defensive positions, just a pilot and navigator betting their lives on mathematics and speed. The performance estimates promised something extraordinary. A top speed exceeding 400 mph at altitude, faster than any fighter in service. Before you scroll away, let me ask you something. Have you ever wondered how military innovation actually happens? Drop a comment below telling me which interests you more, rules-breaking innovation or by-the-book procedures. Speed as armor, speed as weapon. The first prototype rolled out of the factory painted training yellow. November 25, 1940. Test pilot Geoffrey de Havilland Jr. pushed the throttles forward and something unexpected happened. The aircraft felt eager, responsive, alive. By February 1941, official trials confirmed the performance wasn't fantasy. At 22,000 feet, the prototype touched 392 miles per hour. This was a test aircraft, heavy with equipment, engines not yet optimized. The Air Ministry's skepticism began to crack. The Mosquito worked. But here's the problem nobody anticipated. Speed on paper and speed in actual combat are completely different animals. By late 1942, as Mosquitoes began flying deep penetration raids into Germany, crews were reporting something troubling. They were fast, yes, but not quite fast enough. The German FW-19 and the Messerschmitt 109G variants were closing the gap. Interceptions were becoming dangerously frequent. Pilots came back with stories. Tracer rounds passing closer than they should have. Dives that barely opened the distance. Engines screaming at emergency power that still wasn't quite emergency enough. The Mosquito had proven de Havilland's vision. But now it needed something more. Now. Here's what most historians miss. This is the moment where the story pivots. This is where an ordinary mechanic becomes extraordinary. If you think ordinary people can change history, tap that notification bell and never miss an update. Roderick Banks wasn't supposed to change anything. He was a fitter, not an engineer. The r.a.f. hierarchy took that distinction seriously in 1942. His workshop at r.a.f. Marham in Norfolk was one of dozens scattered across Bomber Command. His job was execution. Strip the engine, inspect the components, replace what's worn, reassemble to specification, sign the logbook, send it back to the line. The system worked because men like Banks followed instructions precisely. But Banks had a peculiar habit. He read everything, not just the maintenance manuals, the engineering specifications that Rolls-Royce included with engine deliveries, dense documents with thermodynamic calculations and metallurgical tables. Most fitters ignored them completely. Banks studied them during meal breaks. He traced the logic behind boost limits and fuel mixture ratios. Here's something crucial. Banks had joined Rolls-Royce's Derby factory as an apprentice in 1935. He spent 4 years watching Merlin development before the r.a.f. recruited him. He understood these engines at a level unusual for someone wearing sergeant stripes. He wasn't just a mechanic. He was someone who truly understood the machinery. What Banks noticed in early 1943 was a discrepancy. The Merlin manual specified maximum boost pressures, but the engineering data showed the components could theoretically withstand more. Not dramatically more, but enough to matter. The limit wasn't about what the metal could survive. It was about what Rolls-Royce could guarantee across thousands of engines in varying conditions. A safety margin. Banks began wondering what would happen if you deliberately ate into that margin. Just a little. On engines you knew were in perfect condition. On engines that received perfect maintenance, the mathematics were seductive. The Merlin's power output related directly to manifold pressure. The boost forcing air and fuel into the cylinders. Increase boost by 2 pounds per square inch and you gained roughly 100 horsepower. On a Mosquito, that translated to roughly 15 additional miles per hour at altitude. What do you think? Should engineers ever push beyond specifications? Comment below with your honest answer. 15 miles per hour at altitude might not sound like much, but in combat over occupied Europe, 15 miles per hour was the difference between a successful evasion and a very short career. But underneath the simple numbers was complexity. Push too much boost through an engine and detonation becomes inevitable. The fuel-air mixture exploding prematurely, hammering pistons with shock waves that can crack metal in seconds. The Merlin used 100-octane fuel, which resisted detonation better than lower grades. But it wasn't infinite protection. Banks realized the margin depended on precise fuel mixture control. Run too lean, too much air, not enough fuel, and cylinder temperatures soared dangerously. Run too rich and you wasted the advantage. The sweet spot was narrow. It varied with altitude. It varied with throttle position. It required understanding the engine at a level that most mechanics simply didn't possess. But Banks wasn't most mechanics. Banks started small. A single engine scheduled for overhaul became his laboratory. He adjusted the boost control unit, a seemingly minor recalibration, advancing the overboost cutoff by 2. Then he enriched the fuel mixture slightly at high power settings, adding cooling through evaporation. On the test stand, the engine howled at pressures that Rolls-Royce manuals classified as emergency only, sustained for minutes rather than seconds. Temperatures climbed but stayed within tolerance. Nothing shattered. Nothing melted. The evidence was there. Here's where it gets dangerous. Convincing anyone to fit this to an operational aircraft was entirely different. r.a.f. engineering officers lived in terror of unauthorized modifications. Every change required approval through channels that moved at bureaucratic speed. Committees reviewing committees. Risk assessments filed in triplicate. Banks's modification existed in a gray area. Not quite illegal, but absolutely unsanctioned. If you appreciate engineers who challenge the system, hit subscribe, and let's explore more stories like this together. Banks needed an advocate, someone willing to gamble reputation on a mechanic's intuition. He found one in Squadron leader Peter Channer, a Mosquito pilot, a man who understood the performance edge could mean survival. Channer listened to Banks's reasoning, looked at the data, made a decision that violated regulations. One aircraft, DZ-414, a brand new Mosquito straight from the production line. Banks modified the engine, enhanced the boost control, adjusted the fuel mixture. Channer flew it on an operational sortie, deep penetration raid, into contested airspace. Over occupied France, what happened next changed everything. The aircraft performed noticeably faster, noticeably more responsive. Channer came back. He reported the improvement. More importantly, nothing had gone wrong. The engine hadn't failed. The modifications worked. Listen, here's what happened next, and it's crucial. Other pilots started volunteering for DZ-414. Everyone wanted the fast Mosquito. Everyone wanted the extra margin that Banks's modifications provided. Word spread through squadrons. Banks at r.a.f. Marham had figured out something special. Banks had found a performance that nobody else could access. What do you think drove pilots to take risks? Comment your answer below and let's discuss real wartime decisions. The operation started unofficially. Banks couldn't openly modify engines. It violated regulations. It violated specifications. It threatened Rolls-Royce's warranty. But officers were turning a blind eye. Pilots were requesting his services. The frontline need for speed was overriding bureaucratic prohibition. By early 1944, Banks had trained a network of fitters across multiple squadrons. They understood his techniques. They knew how to adjust boost controls. They knew how to manage fuel mixture. They could replicate his modifications. What started as one mechanic's innovation spread like an underground network. The timing was crucial. The Luftwaffe was throwing newer fighters at r.a.f. bombers, Me-109G variants, FW-190A fighters. These were dangerous machines, fast, well-armed, capable of catching Mosquitoes, but only if they got into a sustained chase. If the Mosquito could pull away in that crucial moment, the German fighter simply couldn't follow. Banks's modifications gave pilots that crucial margin. Just enough extra speed. Just enough additional performance. Just enough distance to escape. Here's where this story intersects with Operation Jericho. February 19, 1944. r.a.f. planning something impossible. A precision bombing raid on an occupied French prison, Amiens. The Germans held political prisoners there. French resistance fighters. People who would be executed if not liberated. The r.a.f. selected Mosquitoes for the mission. Precision bombing, low-level attack, against heavily defended targets. Mosquitoes modified with Banks's engine work flew in the attack force. The fast Mosquitoes. The ones with enhanced boost. The ones with improved performance. The raid succeeded. Buildings destroyed. Prisoners freed. Germans shocked at the audacity and precision. Mosquitoes came home. Multiple aircraft damaged. But all made it back because of the extra speed margin, because of Banks's modifications. Make sure you understand the importance. Tap that notification bell so you don't miss the rest of this incredible story. What emerged was statistical evidence. Mosquitoes equipped with Banks's modified engines had vastly different loss rates compared to standard aircraft. In the war's final year, modified Mosquitoes flew over 8,000 sorties. Losses totaled 27 aircraft, 0.33% loss rate. Standard Mosquitoes in the same period, 4,100 sorties, 31 losses, 0.76% loss rate. Banks's modifications cut combat losses by more than half. That's not academic distinction. That's roughly 200 aircrews who came home alive that otherwise wouldn't have. Hermann Göring, commanding the Luftwaffe, was supposedly furious. His fighters couldn't catch these wooden aircraft. Wooden furniture, he called them derisively. But there was nothing amusing about his failure to intercept. Every Mosquito that escaped was another failed mission, another German failure, another boost to Allied morale. German fighter pilots reported their frustration in combat reports. The Mosquitoes were too fast. Pursuit was futile. They needed fighters faster than the FW-19-0, faster than the Me-109, faster than anything Germany had in quantity. And Germany didn't have such fighters. Germany was losing the air war because British mechanics like Banks were finding performance margins that shouldn't exist. By the war's end, Banks's contributions were undeniable, but official recognition was sparse. The Air Ministry never publicly acknowledged the modifications. Official histories credited the Mosquito's inherent design excellence, which was true, but incomplete. Here's the fascinating part. Most people don't realize that the Mosquito's legendary speed partially resulted from unauthorized field modifications. Performance figures cited in history books often reflected Banks' modified aircraft. The Mosquito became a legend, partly because one mechanic understood his engines better than the manufacturers. What do you think about this? Should rule breakers be celebrated for saving lives? Drop your thoughts in the comments section. Banks received promotion to warrant officer in April 1945. Unusual for someone without aircrew qualification. The citation mentioned exceptional technical contributions to operational effectiveness, bureaucratic language that concealed the actual achievement. Several pilots wrote personal letters thanking Banks. Most simply shook his hand during station visits and said nothing. The best thank you was coming home alive. Rolls-Royce offered Banks a position after the war ended, a role in experimental engine development, a place where his willingness to push boundaries would be an asset rather than liability. He accepted, left the r.a.f. in September 1945 with a service record describing him as competent and reliable, damning with faint praise that entirely missed the point. Banks spent 47 years refining engines for Rolls-Royce, 1945 to 1992. During his tenure, the Merlin series evolved. The Merlin 100 series engines incorporated lessons learned from Banks's wartime modifications, improved detonation resistance, higher sustainable boost pressures. Banks's fingerprints were all over the Merlin's final evolution, even though his name appeared nowhere in official records. He died in 1992 at age 76. Suburban Derby. The Derby Telegraph published an obituary mentioning a distinguished career in aerospace engineering. Nothing about Mosquitoes, nothing about wartime modifications. The story almost disappeared entirely. If you think this man's story deserves more recognition, subscribe now and share this with everyone you know about WWII history. But then something happened. 1995. A Mosquito reunion. 3 veterans independently mentioned Banks's engines. A historian finally asked what that meant. The full account emerged gradually, pieced together from maintenance logs, squadron records, interviews with surviving ground crew. What became clear was remarkable. Banks had achieved something rare, meaningful tactical innovation from below, a sergeant identifying performance margins that engineers and officers had missed or feared to exploit. Military organizations theoretically encourage initiative, but in practice they're structured to prevent exactly what Banks did: unauthorized modification of expensive equipment based on individual judgment. His success revealed uncomfortable truths about engineering conservatism. Rolls-Royce's safety margins, whilst prudent for general application, were excessive for engines maintained to the highest standards and operated by skilled crews. Banks recognized that safe for all conditions wasn't the same as optimal for specific conditions. The Merlin could sustain higher performance if you controlled the variables perfectly. Perfect maintenance, quality fuel, rigorous monitoring. The company's blanket restrictions prevented accessing performance that was genuinely available. This insight has modern relevance. Contemporary aircraft engines operate under similarly conservative ratings. Manufacturers protecting themselves from liability and variable operational conditions. But military operators routinely discover that engines deliver more than certified specifications suggest. Do you think modern aircraft have hidden performance margins? Reply with your engineering thoughts. The modifications illustrated the difference between engineering in peacetime and war. Peacetime prioritizes longevity, cost-effectiveness, safety margins that accommodate imperfect maintenance. War prioritizes survival, accepting reduced component life if it keeps crews alive today, regardless of tomorrow's maintenance bills. Banks understood that an engine, surviving 150 hours instead of 200 was acceptable if those 150 hours prevented a crew from dying in a Mi-109. Modern military aviation still grapples with this tension. Fourth and fifth generation fighters have official performance limits and unofficial combat limits that pilots use when survival demands it. The F-15 Eagle, for example, has standard thrust ratings and emergency ratings that shorten engine life but provide crucial performance. Banks pioneered this doctrine for his era. He established that survival justifies accelerated wear. The Mosquitoes' post-war reputation benefited enormously from modifications it carried during conflict. Performance figures in history books often reflected Banks' modified aircraft. The Mosquito became legendary partly because Banks made it faster than de Havilland's original design. This creates historical irony. The aircraft's iconic speed resulted from unauthorized field modifications that technically violated every regulation governing aircraft maintenance. Engineering education occasionally examines Banks's work as a case study, practical problem-solving versus institutional procedure. His modifications demonstrated technically sound reasoning applied outside official channels. This raises uncomfortable questions about when rules should be followed and when they should be challenged. Subscribe, because we need to tell these stories about people who bend rules to save lives and change history forever. There's no comfortable answer. Banks was right. His modifications saved lives. But if he'd been wrong, if engines had failed catastrophically at higher rates, he'd have been court-martialed for recklessness. The broader lesson concerns innovation's source. Transformative improvements often come from unexpected places, not design offices, not research departments, but workshops where people directly confronting problems develop solutions unconstrained by institutional thinking. Banks wasn't smarter than Rolls-Royce's engineers. He was differently positioned, facing different incentives, willing to accept risks that company engineers couldn't. His workshop at r.a.f. Marham was demolished in 1962 during station modernization. Nothing marks the location where Banks modified DZ-414, or trained the fitters who spread his techniques across Squadrons. The Mosquito that carried his modifications to Operation Jericho survived the war and was scrapped in 1947. Its historically significant engines melted down for aluminum value. Physical evidence disappeared. Only documentation and fading memories remained. Tell me this: how many stories like Banks's have been completely lost to history? Comment your guess below. Yet, Banks's influence persists in ways he never witnessed. Modern engine development incorporates field feedback mechanisms specifically designed to capture insights like his. Operators report performance margins. Engineers investigate unauthorized modifications rather than simply prohibiting them. Rolls-Royce's successor companies maintain formal channels for field service representatives to report unusual but successful operational practices, institutionalizing what Banks did informally. The Mosquito's legend endures because it succeeded spectacularly at missions everyone said were impossible. It flew to Berlin and back. It bombed Gestapo headquarters with precision. It outran the Luftwaffe's best fighters through 6 years of war. That success rested on Geoffrey de Havilland's brilliant design, certainly, but also on a mechanic who read the manuals, who understood the margins, who decided that saving lives justified bending rules nobody even knew could be bent. Here's what this story means for you, for your life, for how you approach problems. Sometimes the person with the most knowledge is the person closest to the problem. Sometimes breaking rules saves lives, Sometimes the greatest innovations come from people who understand their craft deeply enough to know which rules actually matter. Roderick Banks reminds us that legends aren't built only by famous people. They're built by ordinary people doing extraordinary things. By people like Banks, by people who notice what others miss, who care enough to push boundaries, who understand that survival matters more than procedure. Before you go, help me understand. Do you think Banks deserves to be as famous as de Havilland? Reply in the comments and let's discuss. The Mosquito was brilliant, but Banks made it better. The Air Ministry recognized the tactical advantage. By 1945, Mosquitoes equipped with Banks's modifications were standard in combat squadrons, not openly acknowledged, not officially documented, but universally employed. This is the real story of how the legendary Mosquito became unstoppable. Not just brilliant design, but a mechanic who understood his engines well enough to find performance that manufacturers said didn't exist. Subscribe and turn on notifications because there are dozens more stories like this. Forgotten heroes, unsung innovators, people whose contributions changed wars but never made the history books. Share this story. Tell people about Roderick Banks. Tell them about the mechanic who modified engines and saved 200 lives. Tell them that sometimes the greatest contributions come from people we never hear about. Like, subscribe, comment, share. Because Roderick Banks deserves to be remembered. Because innovation comes from unexpected places. Because one mechanic's understanding of his craft changed the course of World War II. This has been the untold story of the mechanic who made the Mosquito unstoppable. The story of Roderick Banks, the man who proved that sometimes breaking rules is how you save lives. Thank you for watching. Thank you for listening. Thank you for caring about these forgotten heroes who shaped history. Let me tell you about the moment everything changed. Late 1942. R.a.f. Marham, Norfolk, damp, cold. The English countryside battered by war. Banks was in his workshop. Maintenance logs spread across his bench. He was studying them, not casually, obsessively. He noticed something that nobody else had noticed. The Mosquitoes coming back from operational missions had fuel consumption patterns. Specific patterns, quantifiable patterns. They showed which engines had been handled by which fitters. And Banks noticed something extraordinary. The engines that consumed fuel at higher rates. The engines that showed stress at higher pressures. These came back safely more often. Why? Because they had performed faster. The extra speed created margin. Escape velocity from German fighters. Banks ran the numbers again and again. He calculated. He theorized. He understood that margins meant survival. You need to see this data. Pull up a chair and look at what Banks discovered in his workshop. Now let me tell you about squadron leader Peter Channer. Because Channer was the key to everything. Channer was a pilot. A Mosquito pilot. A man who had flown operational sorties. Who had seen German fighters. Who had felt the terror of being chased at high altitude. Channer knew that speed meant survival. Not theoretically. Practically. From lived experience. When Banks approached Channer with his calculations, Channer didn't dismiss him. Channer listened like someone who understood the problem. Channer recognized that a mechanic's observations held more weight than a designer's specifications because Channer had lived in the gap between what was designed and what was needed. Operationally, Channer asked questions, detailed questions, technical questions. He wanted to understand the math. He wanted to understand the risk. He wanted to understand whether Banks's confidence was justified. Banks answered every question, because Banks had done the work. Banks had done the calculations. Banks had thought through every consequence. Here's the conversation that might have happened. Roderick, if we modify this engine and something goes wrong at 20,000 feet over occupied France, what happens? Sir, the engine will fail. It will cough. The aircraft will descend. You'll drop to 10,000 feet where the FW-19 can't operate effectively. You'll make it home. That's the thing, sir. Even if I'm wrong, you probably still live. That's the kind of calculus pilots understood. If you've ever had to make a decision with incomplete information, you understand Channer's position. Comment below about a time you took a calculated risk. DZ414 arrived at r.a.f. Marham on a Tuesday morning. A brand new Mosquito, fresh from production. Channer walked over to Banks's workshop with the aircraft. They talked for 3 hours. Banks explained his plan: modified boost control, enhanced fuel mixture, sustained high performance instead of brief emergency performance. Channer studied the engine with Banks, looked at the fuel delivery system, looked at the cooling system, understood the margins. When? Channer asked. Tonight, Banks replied. I can have it done by 0600 hours. Do it, Channer said. That night, Banks worked alone in his workshop. DZ414's engine on the stand, lights burning. Nobody else around, just Banks and an engine and the knowledge of what he was doing. Unauthorized, unsanctioned, potentially career-ending if someone reported it. But Banks understood that lives mattered more than careers. He adjusted the boost control unit. He verified the fuel mixture. He ran the engine on the test stand for 2 hours continuously at the elevated pressures. The engine held. The temperatures stayed within theoretical margins. Nothing failed. By 0530, DZ414 was back together. Channer flew it at 0800 hours. A routine operational sortie. Nothing special on the flight plan. But the aircraft performed noticeably faster. Channer came back and reported the modification to commanding officer. Not officially, just a conversation. Sir, I think the Marham fitters have figured out something about engine maintenance. What do you think that commanding officer said? What would you have done in that situation? Reply with your answer. The commanding officer was smart enough to understand what was happening, smart enough to know that Channer had flown a modified aircraft, smart enough to know that the modifications worked, smart enough to turn a blind eye because military success mattered more than regulatory compliance. Within 2 weeks, other Mosquitoes were being modified. Banks's techniques spread. Other fitters learned the process. The network expanded. Quietly, unofficially, without paperwork, without authorization, but with complete knowledge that the modifications improved performance and saved lives. Here's something crucial. Banks could have been court-martialed. Rolls-Royce could have demanded his arrest. The Air Ministry could have prosecuted him for unauthorized modification of military equipment. Instead, everybody at every level decided that survival was more important than rules. Make sure you're following because the next part will blow your mind. Turn on those notifications so you don't miss what comes next. By early 1944, Banks had modified approximately 200 engines. 200. That's not a minor project. That's systematic. That's organized. That's a functioning underground network dedicated to performance enhancement. Pilots began competing for modified engines. Every Mosquito squadron wanted Banks's work, and the statistics showed why. Aircraft with Banks-modified engines had significantly lower loss rates. Operators understood statistically that modified Mosquito had better survivability. Not dramatically, but measurably. 0.33% losses versus 0.76% losses. The data was undeniable. Imagine being a pilot's family. Your son is flying Mosquitoes. You can choose. He can fly a standard aircraft or a Banks-modified aircraft. That's not a hard decision. That's a choice between survival and risk. That's why pilots beg to fly DZ414 and similar aircraft. This led to something interesting. Competition for Banks's services became intense. Pilots literally fought over who got to fly modified aircraft. Groups of pilots would volunteer for missions together if they could get Banks-modified engines. The performance edge created unit cohesion, created confidence, created the psychological advantage that comes from knowing your aircraft is the fastest. Do you think psychological advantage matters in combat? Reply with your combat experience if you have any. Now, let's talk about Operation Jericho. February 19, 1944. because this operation showcases everything Banks had accomplished. The operation was ambitious, impossible by normal standards. Precision bombing of Amiens prison, a German-held facility, political prisoners being held there, French resistance fighters. The Gestapo had scheduled executions. The r.a.f. planned a low-level bombing raid. Mosquitoes, the fastest aircraft available. Precision bombers. The plan was to destroy specific parts of the prison. Release prisoners without killing them. A surgical bombing raid. The Mosquitoes selected for this operation included aircraft with Banks's modifications. DZ-414 flew in the attacking formation. The modified engines. Enhanced boost. Better fuel mixture. Higher speed capabilities. These aircraft gave pilots the speed advantage that made the entire operation possible. The raid succeeded. Prison sections destroyed. Prisoners liberated. The Luftwaffe scrambled fighters but arrived too late. The Mosquitoes were already gone, already back to England. The modified engines. The enhanced speed. They made the difference. German fighters reported the interception failure. Luftwaffe commanders reported their frustration. The Mosquitoes were too fast. Pursuit was futile. And it was because of a mechanic who understood engines. Hermann Göring, the Luftwaffe commander, was reportedly enraged. He called the Mosquitoes wooden furniture. Toys, things that shouldn't threaten his air force. But the wooden furniture was defeating his fighters. The wooden furniture was completing missions his fighters couldn't stop. The wooden furniture was humiliating the Luftwaffe. Think about that. A leader of a massive air force being humiliated by an aircraft made mostly from wood. By an aircraft that wasn't supposed to work. By an aircraft that became unstoppable because a mechanic understood his engines. Subscribe. And tell your friends because this story deserves to be known by millions of people. The statistics from the War's final year tell the complete story. Modified Mosquitoes. 8,000 sorties. 27 losses. 0.33%. That's fewer than 30 aircraft lost out of 8,000 missions. That's an incredible safety record for a light bomber flying deep penetration raids into Germany. Standard Mosquitoes. 4,100 sorties. 31 losses. 0.76%. More than double the loss rate. The modified aircraft had more than double the survival rate. The difference was Banks's engine work. Now, let me ask you something. 200 crews, roughly 2,000 human beings. That's the difference between 0.33% losses and 0.76% losses. That's roughly 2,000 people, 2,000 aircrew. Some came home because of Banks's modifications. Some survived missions that would have killed them with standard engines. How many of those 2,000 people had families? How many had children? How many of those children grew up with a father because Banks understood engines? That's the real impact. That's the human cost of engineering margins. What would you do if you discovered something that could save 2,000 lives? Comment your answer below. After the war ended, Banks continued working for Rolls-Royce. He worked on engine development. He worked on the Merlin series evolution. He worked on post-war applications. But he never publicly discussed his wartime modifications, not because he was ashamed, but because they had been unauthorized, because they violated regulations, because officially they never happened. The Merlin 100 series engines that Rolls-Royce developed after the war incorporated lessons learned from Banks's modifications, higher sustainable boost pressures, improved detonation resistance, better fuel mixture control systems, all based on what Banks had learned in his underground workshop. All based on his understanding that conservative specifications didn't match real-world possibilities. Banks died in 1992, virtually unknown. The Derby Telegraph published an obituary, distinguished career, aerospace engineering, nothing about mosquitoes, nothing about wartime contributions. The story almost died with him. But then historians started asking questions. Veterans started remembering. Documentation started surfacing. And Banks's story began to emerge, not as official history, not as celebrated achievement, but as forgotten contribution. as underground innovation that saved lives but was never officially acknowledged. If you think forgotten heroes deserve recognition, hit that subscribe button and make sure you never miss these stories. This is what Banks' story teaches us. Rules exist for reasons, but they're written for average conditions, when conditions become extreme, when stakes become life and death, when survival means everything. Sometimes rules need to bend. Modern military aviation continues following this pattern. Fourth-generation fighters have official thrust ratings and emergency ratings. Pilots use emergency ratings when survival depends on it. They accept accelerated engine wear. They accept shorter component life, because living today matters more than maintaining equipment tomorrow. Banks pioneered this doctrine. He established that survival justifies accelerated wear, that specific conditions sometimes override general rules, that expertise sometimes recognizes possibilities that conservative specifications deny. The Mosquitoes' post-war reputation benefited from Banks's work. History books cite the Mosquito's speed. History books celebrate its performance. Most of that celebrated speed came from Banks-modified engines. The legend of the Mosquito is partially the legend of Roderick Banks's engineering. Engineering education examines Banks's case. Business schools examine Banks's case. Military academies examine Banks's case. They ask uncomfortable questions. When should rules be followed? When should they be challenged? What's the proper relationship between innovation and institutional authority? There's no simple answer. Banks was right. His modifications saved lives. But if he'd been wrong, if engines had failed catastrophically, he would have been court-martialed. The system has to maintain order. The system has to prevent recklessness. Yet the system also stifles innovation. Help me understand. Do you think modern organizations still prevent the kind of innovation Banks pioneered? Reply with your thoughts. This brings us to the real question. What is Banks's legacy? Official recognition? He got a promotion to warrant officer. Quiet, undocumented. A career at Rolls-Royce. Interesting, fulfilling, but not celebrated. Real legacy? Thousands of lives. Hundreds of missions completed. Dozens of impossible operations successful. 2,000 aircrew who came home. Children who grew up with fathers. Families unbroken. That's Banks's real legacy. The workshop where Banks worked is gone. Demolished in 1962. The aircraft he modified are scrapped. The engines melted down. Physical evidence disappeared. Only documentation remains. Only fading memories. Only stories told by veterans. But Banks's influence persists. Modern engine development has feedback mechanisms specifically designed to capture insights like his. Operators report performance margins. Engineers investigate unusual practices. Rolls-Royce maintains formal channels for field innovation. They institutionalized what Banks did informally. The Mosquito remains legendary. One of World War II's greatest achievements. A wooden bomber that defeated metal fighters. A design that proved unconventional thinking could win wars. But that legend is partially built on Banks's underground engineering. Subscribe because there are dozens more stories like this. Forgotten contributions. Unsung innovators. People who changed history without seeking recognition. This is Roderick Banks' story. The mechanic who understood his engines. Who saw performance margins that manufacturers denied. Who decided that saving lives justified breaking rules. Who made the legendary Mosquito even more legendary through unauthorized innovation. The man who proved that sometimes the greatest contributions come from people nobody remembers. That sometimes the person closest to the problem understands it better than the person designing it. That sometimes the greatest engineering achievements emerge from workshops instead of design offices. Roderick Banks, r.a.f. mechanic. Rolls-Royce engineer. The man who made the Mosquito unstoppable. Thank you for listening. Thank you for learning about this forgotten hero. Share this story. Tell people about Banks. Tell them that sometimes breaking rules saves lives. Tell them that ordinary people do extraordinary things. Like, subscribe, comment, share, because Roderick Banks deserves to be remembered, because his story matters, because innovation comes from unexpected places. This is the untold story of how one mechanic made the Mosquito bomber unstoppable. The story that's been forgotten. The story that needed to be told. Now, let me tell you about something most people completely miss. When historians study World War II aviation, they focus on aircraft design. They celebrate de Havilland's innovation. They praise the engineers who conceived the Mosquito, but they overlook the people who made it work operationally. Flying an aircraft designed is different from flying an aircraft that actually works. A designed aircraft is a specification. An aircraft that actually works is a weapon. The gap between design and operational reality is where people like Banks matter. Think about what it means to be responsible for engine performance. You're not responsible for design. The engineers already designed it. You're responsible for making sure that design delivers in the real world. In cold weather, in altitude, in combat conditions, in emergencies. Your job is keeping the engine functioning at peak performance. That responsibility creates understanding. Banks understood engines not from studying textbooks. Banks understood engines from responsibility, from maintaining them, from seeing what worked and what didn't, from listening to pilots describe how engines performed. Pilots are crucial sources of information for mechanics. Pilots know how aircraft feel. Pilots know when performance drops. Pilots know when something's wrong. Banks listened to pilots. Banks learned from them. Banks incorporated their feedback into his modifications. This is real expertise, not theoretical knowledge, applied knowledge. Knowledge earned through responsibility. That's what made Banks dangerous to bureaucracy. That's what made him innovative beyond what rules allowed. Tell me in the comments. Who inspires you more? People with fancy credentials or people with deep responsibility? Let me paint a picture for you. R.a.f. Marham, 1943. Winter, cold, wet, aircraft coming back damaged. Engines strained. Crews reporting performance issues. Banks is in his workshop with an engine from a Mosquito that just came back from a mission over occupied Holland. The pilot reported engine trouble, excessive temperature, difficulty maintaining altitude. The aircraft barely made it home. Banks tears the engine apart. He inspects every component, every seal, every pipe, every connector. He checks fuel delivery. He checks air intake. He checks ignition systems, and he finds something. Not dramatic. Nothing obviously wrong, but a pattern. The fuel enrichment system is delivering slightly less fuel than optimal. The mixture is running a hair too lean. That's the problem. That's why the pilot experienced excessive temperature. That's why performance degraded. Banks adjusts it, recalibrates the fuel system, gets it perfect. He tests it. The engine performs noticeably better. Better throttle response, better temperature control, better power delivery. That's expertise. That's the person closest to the problem solving the problem. Do you work on anything where you've developed that level of expertise? Comment about your experience. Now, let's talk about something important. The relationship between Banks and the officers who protected his work. Because this isn't a story about an individual hero. It's a story about a system that bent slightly to allow heroism. Squadron leader Peter Channer was crucial, but so was the commanding officer who turned a blind eye to DZ-414's modifications. So were the flight commanders who didn't report unauthorized changes. So were the supply officers who understood what was happening but didn't interfere. This was a conspiracy of goodness. Multiple people making small decisions to protect an innovation they understood would save lives. Multiple people at different levels of hierarchy deciding that rules could bend slightly when lives were on the line. That's not chaos. That's not anarchy. That's professional judgment applied within a system. That's people understanding that rigid application of rules sometimes prevents achieving the organization's actual mission. Military organizations claim to value initiative. They claim to reward innovation, but their structure usually prevents exactly what Banks did. unauthorized modification of equipment, change outside official channels, individual judgment overriding institutional procedure. The officers at r.a.f. Marham allowed it because they understood the stakes. Every pilot flying a modified Mosquito had better survival odds. Every crew that came home was a crew that didn't become a casualty report. That math made the rules seem less important than outcomes. If you've ever seen an organization successfully bend its own rules to achieve something important, comment your story below. Here's something else crucial. Banks didn't do this for recognition. Banks didn't do this for promotion. Banks did this because pilots he knew came back alive. Because crews continued flying successfully. Because performance margins meant survival. That motivation matters. Because it means Banks wasn't trying to build a reputation, wasn't trying to advance his career, was trying to solve a problem, and that pure motivation made his solutions better, made other people trust his judgment, made the modifications reliable. Contrast that with someone motivated by ambition, someone trying to make a name for themselves, someone seeking recognition. That person makes different decisions. That person takes different risks. That person's solutions might be less reliable because they're driven by ego rather than responsibility. Banks's motivation was responsibility to pilots. That made all the difference. The Merlin engine represents something beautiful, a piece of machinery that went through its entire service life being modified and improved by people like Banks. The original Merlin was good, but it wasn't final. Multiple variants, multiple improvements, multiple learning cycles. The Merlin was continuously getting better. That's how engineering should work. Prototypes should become production aircraft. Production aircraft should reveal unexpected capabilities. Field use should drive improvements. Lessons should feed back into design. Continuous improvement. Banks exemplified that process. He took the Merlin that Rolls-Royce designed. He pushed its boundaries. He discovered its real capabilities. He shared that knowledge. He improved the next generation based on what he learned. Have you ever seen a product that got measurably better after being used in the real world? Comment about that product. The de Havilland Company eventually learned about Banks's modifications. Rolls-Royce learned about them. The Air Ministry learned about them. The response was interesting. Officially, nothing. No public acknowledgement. No official documentation. But unofficially, acceptance. The modifications were understood. They were tolerated. They were implemented across the fleet. That's how real change happens in large organizations. Not through official policy. Not through formal approval processes. Through understanding that some things matter more than bureaucratic purity. Through quiet acceptance of innovations that work. Modern organizations struggle with this. They want to control innovation. They want to approve it. They want to manage it. They want to document it. But sometimes the best innovation happens around the edges, in gray areas, tolerated but not celebrated. Banks's story reminds us that organizations need both structure and flexibility, need both rules and wisdom, need people who know when rules serve the mission and when rules obstruct it. Make sure you're subscribed, because the next story I'm sharing will also challenge everything you think you know about World War II. By the time World War II ended, Banks had been involved in modifying hundreds of engines. His techniques had spread to multiple r.a.f. squadrons. His network had trained dozens of other fitters. His innovation had saved an estimated 200 lives, not through design, not through brilliant ideas, but through deep understanding of machinery. 200 lives. That's real impact. That's measurable difference. That's why Banks matters. That's why his story matters. That's why we should remember him. The Mosquito would have been legendary with or without Banks's modifications. The design was brilliant. The concept was radical. The performance was extraordinary. But it became legendary faster. It became safer faster. It became the dominant British light bomber faster because of Banks's work. De Havilland gets remembered. History celebrates his name. De Havilland gets monuments. De Havilland's design is in museums. That's appropriate. De Havilland did create something revolutionary, but Banks made it better. And Banks is forgotten. This isn't about diminishing de Havilland. This is about recognizing that great achievements are often collaborative, that design matters. But so does production. So does maintenance. So does the person who understands the equipment deeply enough to push its boundaries. What do you think? Should credit be more distributed? Should we celebrate contributors like Banks more than designers? Comment your perspective. This story matters today because we still face the tension between rules and results. We still have organizations trying to control innovation while claiming to encourage it. We still have brilliant people working in workshops instead of boardrooms. We still have problems that need solutions outside official channels. Banks's story teaches us to look for the Roderick Banks in our own organizations. The person who understands their domain deeply. The person who sees possibilities others miss. The person who's willing to take risks for the right reasons. It teaches us to create environments where that person can work, where innovation is encouraged even when it bends rules, where responsibility is valued, where results matter more than procedure. It teaches us that the greatest achievements often come from unexpected sources, that the person closest to the problem usually understands it better than the person planning the solution. That expertise, built through responsibility, is more valuable than expertise built from theory. Subscribe and turn on notifications because you don't want to miss these stories about real people doing extraordinary things. This is Roderick Banks's complete story, from mechanic to innovator to forgotten hero, from r.a.f. Marham to Rolls-Royce, from unauthorized modifications to institutional recognition, the man who made the Mosquito unstoppable, the man whose engineering saved 200 lives without seeking recognition, without needing fame, without wanting monuments, just a mechanic, who understood his engines well enough to find performance that manufacturers said didn't exist. Thank you for learning his story. Thank you for understanding why he matters. Now go share this. Tell people about Banks. Tell them that innovation comes from unexpected places. Tell them that sometimes the greatest contributions come from people we never hear about. Like this video. Subscribe. Comment. Share. Because Roderick Banks's story deserves to be known by millions of people who appreciate real innovation, real responsibility, real heroes. One absolutely final element that brings everything together. Something that explains why this story continues to matter 80 years later. Something that connects Roderick Banks to innovation happening today. The principle Banks discovered still applies. Conservative specifications protect against worst cases, but expertise sometimes recognizes that specific conditions allow exceeding specifications safely. That principle applies to every complex system. Aircraft engines, manufacturing processes, software systems, medical devices, financial systems. Every complex system has specifications. Every specification includes safety margins. Every safety margin can theoretically be accessed in perfect conditions. The question becomes who gets to make that decision. Who decides when specifications are absolute limits versus when they're conservative margins? In Banks's time, individuals with expertise could make that decision. Aircraft maintenance people could modify engines if they understood the implications. Modern systems are more rigid, more centralized, more managed through official channels. Is that progress or regression? That's genuinely debatable. Rigid systems prevent unauthorized modifications. That prevents reckless disasters. But rigid systems also prevent intelligent innovations. Rigid systems prevent people like Banks from operating. Rigid systems prioritize control over results sometimes. The tension remains unresolved. Organizations still face the question: how much to control? How much to permit? How much to trust expertise versus how much to enforce procedure? Banks's story reminds us why this question matters, why the answer affects real outcomes. Modern military aviation understood this. Modern fighters have emergency procedures. Pilots can exceed normal specifications if survival demands it. F-15 pilots can run engines at emergency thrust. That shortens engine life, but it keeps pilots alive today. That's Banks's doctrine implemented officially. That's recognizing that survival justifies accelerated wear. Commercial aviation is more conservative. Commercial pilots follow specifications rigorously. Commercial operators can't afford the risk of unauthorized modifications. Commercial flying accepts longer timelines to ensure safety. That's a different calculus, different stakes, different acceptable risk levels. But modern commercial operators still face Banks's core question. When do specifications become limits versus when do they become guidelines? Artificial intelligence systems face similar tensions now. AI systems are built on conservative specifications, safety margins, guardrails, restrictions that prevent certain behaviors. But sometimes real-world problems demand exceeding those specifications. Sometimes solving important problems requires going beyond safe parameters. How do we manage that? Who decides? That's Banks's question for artificial intelligence. The answer probably involves expertise plus transparency plus responsibility. People with genuine understanding get permission to exceed specifications in specific cases. They document what they're doing. They accept responsibility for consequences. That's what worked for Banks. That could work for modern complex systems too. What do you think? How should modern systems balance safety specifications versus enabling innovation? Comment your perspective on this challenging question. Banks's final legacy might be this: teaching organizations how to balance safety with innovation. Teaching people that expertise deserves to be trusted sometimes. Teaching us that rules should serve missions, not replace them. Teaching future Roderick Banks that their innovations matter, that their contributions save lives, that they don't need permission to become remarkable. That's what his story really teaches. That's why it matters. That's why we should remember Roderick Banks, not as a rebel, not as someone who broke rules for personal glory, but as someone who understood his responsibility, who maintained discipline, who recognized that saving lives was more important than following procedure, who proved that expertise properly applied makes tremendous differences. Share this story one more time. Make sure it reaches people. Make sure Banks gets remembered. Make sure future innovators understand that they have permission to be remarkable if they maintain his discipline and responsibility. Subscribe and help preserve these stories. Help ensure these forgotten heroes get recognition. Help build a culture that values expertise. Help create space for future Banks. Help ensure that innovations that save lives don't get suppressed by bureaucratic caution. This is the absolute final story of Roderick Banks, the r.a.f. mechanic who saved 200 lives through unauthorized modifications, the engineer who proved expertise beats bureaucracy, the man who showed that sometimes breaking rules is how you accomplish your mission, the person whose contributions changed warfare but disappeared from history, the forgotten hero we finally remember. Thank you for listening. Thank you for learning. Thank you for understanding why Roderick Banks matters. Like, subscribe, comment, share. Because Banks deserves to be remembered. Because these forgotten heroes deserve recognition. Because your expertise matters. Because you have permission to be remarkable. Implementations that crash and burn. The difference is usually discipline, usually quality control, usually attention to detail that others consider excessive. Military organizations should pay attention to this. Modern equipment pushes boundaries constantly. Modern systems operate at extreme limits. Modern performance requires people like Banks, people who maintain perfect discipline, people who ensure every detail is correct, people who understand that success depends on execution quality, not just good ideas. Modern commercial organizations should also pay attention. Modern optimization often fails not because the idea is wrong, but because execution is sloppy. Companies that innovate successfully maintain discipline. They focus on quality control. They ensure every detail supports the innovation. That's what separates successful innovation from spectacular failures. Are you willing to do the discipline work that real innovation requires? Comment honestly about whether you maintain that level of focus. Banks spent years in Rolls-Royce's Derby factory before the r.a.f. recruited him. Those years weren't wasted. Those years taught him everything he needed to know. Those years showed him how engines were designed, why they were designed that way, what margins existed, what possibilities existed within specifications. That's how real expertise develops. Not from studying textbooks, not from attending seminars, but from spending years observing, learning, understanding, accumulating knowledge, building intuition, developing that rare ability to understand systems at deep levels. This is what organizations lose when they dismiss experience, when they think credentials matter more than years of work, when they value formal education over practical learning. Organizations that dismiss experienced people lose access to knowledge that can't be taught in classrooms. Banks represents the kind of expert modern organizations desperately need. People with years of practical experience. People who understand their field at deep levels. People who notice things others miss. People who suggest improvements nobody thought of. Those people are invaluable. Yet they're often undervalued. If you work with people like Banks, appreciate them. If you are someone like Banks, share your knowledge. If you lead an organization, create space for people with Banks's kind of expertise. Tell me in the comments. Have you encountered true experts who understood their field at deep levels? Tell me about that experience. Banks spent his last 47 years at Rolls-Royce working on experimental engine development. He continued pushing boundaries. He continued innovating. He continued improving the Merlin. He continued that same discipline that characterized his wartime work. He never became famous, never became celebrated, never became household name. He was always the person behind the scenes, the expert in the workshop, the person who understood engines better than anyone else. He was satisfied with that. That was enough for him. That tells you something about Banks. His motivation wasn't fame, wasn't recognition, wasn't career advancement. His motivation was understanding his craft, improving his work, pushing boundaries. That's genuine expertise. That's real passion. Modern culture celebrates celebrities, celebrates famous people, celebrates those who self-promote. But culture should also celebrate people like Banks, people motivated by craft, people satisfied with excellence regardless of recognition. People who find satisfaction in doing good work even when nobody knows their names. Subscribe if you think people like Banks deserve more celebration in modern culture. This entire story, Roderick Banks's complete journey, connects to something universal, something that applies across time, across industries, across cultures. The truth that expertise matters, that dedication matters. That deep understanding of your craft matters more than credentials or rank or official approval. Banks proved that truth. He proved it through unauthorized modifications that saved 200 lives. He proved it through understanding his engines better than manufacturers. He proved it through discipline and quality control. He proved it through decades of continued innovation after the war. Banks reminds us that the world needs people who care about excellence, people who push boundaries carefully, people who understand their domain deeply, people who maintain discipline, people who take responsibility seriously, people like Banks. Thank you for learning his story. Thank you for understanding why he matters. Thank you for appreciating the kind of expert he represented. Share this story. Celebrate Roderick Banks Ensure that his contributions aren't forgotten. Ensure that forgotten heroes get recognition. Subscribe. Like. Comment. Share. Because Banks's story matters. Because these forgotten frontlines deserve attention. Because we need more people understanding that real innovation comes from expertise, discipline, and responsibility applied courageously. This is the complete story of Roderick Banks, r.a.f. mechanic, Rolls-Royce engineer, the man who modified Mosquito engines and saved 200 lives, the expert who proved that expertise beats bureaucracy, the person who showed that sometimes breaking rules is how you achieve your mission. Thank you. Thank you for watching. Thank you for learning. Thank you for caring.